You ever have one of those moments where you make a small decision, something that seems insignificant at the time, but ends up changing everything? That's exactly what happened to me the day I decided to take a shortcut through the woods. It started like any other afternoon. I was heading back from a friend's place after a late-night study session, my mind still buzzing with equations and theories. We were preparing for finals, and I was feeling the weight of all the information I had to memorize. I was running a bit late, and I remembered hearing about a shortcut through the woods behind our town. I'd walked these trails 1,000 times before on hikes, so I figured, why not? It was supposed to save me at least an hour. The trail started off as expected. Quiet, peaceful, even kind of nice. The sun was hanging low, casting a warm golden light through the trees. I'd never really been one for long walks in nature, but on this particular day, it felt good. Refreshing, even. The path was easy to follow, and I had my phone just in case. Nothing to worry about, or so I thought. After about 20 minutes of walking, I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, had started to fade. It wasn't a sudden thing, more like a gradual drop in noise until there was nothing. Just silence. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the birds had just flown off. Maybe it was just one of those quiet moments that happen sometimes. Still, the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. It was unnerving. Then I noticed the trail was getting narrower, less distinct. The trees on either side of me started closing in, the branches twisting together like they were trying to block out the sky. I told myself I must have veered off the main path without realizing it. It wasn't like I was in unfamiliar territory. I knew these woods, or at least I thought I did. As I walked, I scanned the ground, hoping to catch a glimpse of the path beneath the thickening underbrush. But the dirt was giving way to a carpet of moss and decaying leaves, and I felt a strange urge to keep moving forward, despite the growing discomfort. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just tired from studying. I had so much on my mind. I kept walking, hoping to find a way back to the trail. I mean, how far off could I be, right? But the further I went, the more things felt wrong. The air got colder too. Not a normal evening chill, but a biting, unnatural cold, the kind that seeps into your bones. I zipped up my jacket and kept moving. That's when I saw it. The archway. It was just standing there in the middle of the woods, half buried in the ground. It was made of stone, covered in thick moss and vines, like it had been there for centuries. I don't know how to describe it other than ancient. It didn't belong there. Now I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just turn around? Trust me, I asked myself the same thing later. But at the time, something about the arch pulled me in. It wasn't curiosity exactly, more like compulsion. Like I had to know what was on the other side. I stepped through. The second I crossed the threshold, I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine, like I just walked into a freezer. The light dimmed, even though the sun was still up. And the trees, God, the trees, looked different. They were taller, their trunks twisted and gnarled like they'd been warped over time. The branches above me blocked out most of the sky, casting everything in this weird greenish shadow. I wanted to turn back, but when I looked over my shoulder, the archway was gone. Just gone. There was no path, no trail, nothing. Panic started to set in, but I kept telling myself I was just disoriented. I could find my way out. I just needed to stay calm. But the deeper I went, the more I started seeing things. Shadows darting between the trees, flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the twisted trunks of those ancient trees. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept moving. I had no choice. I came across a small clearing, and for a moment I thought I could find my way back. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating patches of the ground. I took a deep breath, grateful for the brief respite from the oppressive darkness. But even then, something felt off. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift, almost as if they were alive. That's when I saw them. Figures, pale, thin, standing motionless among the trees. At first, I thought they were just shadows, or maybe even tree trunks. But as I got closer, I realized they were watching me. Dozens of them, maybe more, standing still as statues, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. A wave of nausea hit me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, my body kicked into gear. I turned and ran. I didn't care where, as long as it was away from them. My feet pounded against the forest floor, branches scratching at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest. But no matter how far I went, the trees all looked the same. There was no trail, no archway, no way out. And the figures, they were still there, always in the distance, watching, waiting. The whispers started not long after. Soft at first, barely more than a rustle in the leaves. But then they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, taunting, malicious. They were laughing at me. I was trapped. The further I ran, the thicker the trees became, the shadows deepening with each step. It felt as if the woods were closing in on me, swallowing me whole. I stumbled into a thicket, the branches snagging at my clothes like hands trying to hold me back. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to find a way out, but every turn I took seemed to lead me deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, I spotted a faint glow in the distance. It was like a beacon of hope in the suffocating gloom. I pushed my way through the underbrush, driven by a primal need to escape. As I got closer, the light flickered, revealing a small fire surrounded by more of those figures. They sat on the ground, their heads bowed, whispering to one another in a low, eerie murmur. A cold dread washed over me. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, torn between the desire to find safety and the instinct to turn back. I thought about calling out, but I was terrified of what would happen if they turned their gazes toward me. Just as I was about to retreat, one of them lifted its head. Its eyes were hollow, void of any emotion. It stared directly at me, and in that moment, I felt a rush of icy fear grip my heart. The whispers grew louder, the laughter more pronounced, echoing through the trees like a twisted symphony. Before I could react, they all stood up in unison, their movements unnaturally smooth and synchronized. It was as if they had rehearsed this moment. I turned and fled, fear propelling me forward, away from the fire and the figures. But they followed. The forest morphed around me, the trees bending and shifting, as if trying to confuse me, to lead me astray. I felt their presence close behind, the whispers swirling like a tempest in my ears. I stumbled and fell, the ground hard and unforgiving beneath me. I scrambled to my feet and kept running, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle. I could hear them now, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, like a chorus of ghostly echoes. I forced myself to keep moving, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way to escape. I had to find the archway again, had to get back to the other side. Then, just when I thought I'd found a way out, I broke into another clearing. But this one was different. It was filled with the same figures, but they were no longer silent. They were gathered around something, a massive tree in the center, its roots twisted and exposed, pulsing as if alive. I froze in place, staring in horror as they began to chant, their voices rising in an unsettling harmony. The sound filled the air with a chilling resonance, vibrating deep in my bones. I felt compelled to approach, drawn in by the rhythm of their words, but something inside me screamed to turn and run. I backed away slowly, trying to remain unnoticed. The last thing I wanted was to attract their attention. But as I turned to leave, a branch snapped underfoot. The chanting stopped. Every figure turned to face me, their hollow eyes boring into my soul. Time seemed to freeze as I stood there, heart racing, breath caught in my throat. Panic surged through me, and I bolted in the opposite direction, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't stop to look back. I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't breathe, the darkness wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I was disoriented, the trees closing in tighter and tighter, their gnarled branches clawing at me, but I refused to let them win. I stumbled forward, desperately seeking any sign of the archway, any glimpse of the way back. With every step, I felt the shadows lengthening behind me, chasing me, waiting for the moment I would falter. And then I saw it. In the distance, a flicker of light. Hope surged within me, and I ran toward it, bursting through the final line of trees. But it wasn't the archway. I stood at the edge of the woods, staring into a small, familiar clearing near my town. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the landscape. I was back. I had made it. Relief washed over me, and I sank to the ground, breathing heavily, grateful to have escaped. But as I caught my breath and looked around, something felt off. The air was still, unnaturally quiet. I scanned the trees behind me, expecting to see nothing, but then I noticed them. Figures emerging from the shadows, stepping into the fading light. They stood just beyond the tree line, their hollow eyes watching me, waiting. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, panic flooding my veins. I turned and ran, not looking back. I sprinted through the clearing, breaking free of the woods, desperate to get home. When I finally reached my front door, I slammed it shut behind me, bolting it tight. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself it had all been a nightmare, that I had simply lost track of time and wandered too far. But the figures lingered in my mind, their hollow eyes burning into my thoughts. For weeks after that day, I avoided the woods altogether. Whenever I walked by, I felt their eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to take another shortcut. I kept the curtains drawn, the lights on, and the doors locked, convinced that whatever lurked in the woods was still out there, waiting for me to slip up. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But every time I think about those woods, I feel that chill creep down my spine. I still catch glimpses of those figures in my dreams, their whispers echoing in my ears, taunting me with the knowledge that I had escaped once, but that next time there might not be a way out. And deep down, I know if I ever find myself lost in those woods again, I won't be coming back. If you thought that last story was chilling, brace yourself for what's coming next. It was supposed to be a regular road trip. You know, the kind where you hop in the car with some friends, turn the music up, and drive wherever the road takes you. We weren't following any strict itinerary. The only rule was to avoid the highways and stick to the back roads, those small, winding roads where you could still find diners that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. I was driving, and beside me in the passenger seat was Kyle, my best friend since high school. In the back, Josh and Emma were sprawled out, half asleep, lost in their own worlds. We had already covered a lot of ground that day, and we were somewhere deep in the desert, the sun beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. That's when we realized we were lost. I glanced at the GPS on my phone, but it was useless. The screen showed nothing but an empty grid of streets with no names, and we hadn't seen a sign or another car for hours. Guess we took a wrong turn somewhere, I muttered. Kyle, ever the optimist, shrugged. We'll figure it out. Maybe there's a town up ahead where we can ask for directions. I nodded, trying to push away the uneasy feeling settling in the pit of my stomach. It was getting late, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here in the middle of nowhere when it got dark. And then we saw it. A town. It appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the orange light of the setting sun. The buildings were small, old-fashioned, and packed closely together. It looked like one of those forgotten places that had seen better days. But at this point, we didn't care. We needed directions, maybe even a place to crash for the night. Finally, Emma exclaimed from the back. Josh stirred, sitting up and blinking at the sight in front of us. We pulled into the main street, and that's when I first noticed something was off. The streets were empty, completely deserted. Not a single person, not even a car parked along the side. Dust blew lazily through the air, swirling around the cracked pavement. Some of the buildings looked like they hadn't been touched in years, with peeling paint and broken windows. "Where is everyone?" Kyle asked, frowning. "I don't know," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Maybe it's a ghost town or something." Josh laughed nervously. "Or maybe they're just all inside for dinner." We parked the car in front of what looked like a general store. The sign hanging above the door swung slightly in the breeze, creaking with the movement. It felt like something out of an old Western movie. "Let's just ask someone for directions and get out of here," Emma said, her voice tight with unease. I could tell she felt it too. There was something wrong about this place. We got out of the car, the doors closing with heavy thuds in the silence. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. We walked toward the store, and that's when I saw them. People. At least, I think they were people. They were standing in the doorways of the houses that lined the street, just inside the shadows where the fading sunlight couldn't quite reach. Their figures were still, almost unnaturally so, like statues, but their eyes, they were wide open, staring at us. Hollow, Empty. Do you see that? Emma whispered, clutching Josh's arm. Yeah, Josh replied, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell is going on? We stopped walking. I didn't know what to do. My instincts were screaming at me to get back in the car and drive away, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. One of them stepped out of the doorway. I didn't hear the sound of their footsteps, but I saw the movement. Slow, deliberate, and then another figure moved, and another. They began to step out into the street, their faces pale and expressionless. Their clothes hung loosely on their frames, like they didn't quite fit. Back to the car, I whispered. Now, we turned and ran, not bothering to look back. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the keys, trying to unlock the car door. The figures were getting closer, their slow, shuffling steps echoing in the still air. I yanked open the driver's side door and threw myself inside, the others doing the same. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it. Nothing. The engine didn't even make a sound. Come on, I yelled, turning the key again. Still nothing? They're getting closer. Emma screamed from the back seat. I glanced up and saw them, now only a few feet away from the car. Their faces had changed, no longer blank, but twisted into grotesque smiles. And their mouths, God, their mouths. They were wide open, far wider than any human mouth should be, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. What the hell are they? Josh yelled. I don't know, I screamed back, frantically twisting the key in the ignition. The car still wouldn't start. The figures were surrounding us now, their hands reaching out, fingers scraping against the windows. I could hear their breathing, ragged, unnatural. And then one of them leaned in close to my window. I froze. Its face was inches from mine, separated only by the thin pane of glass. Its eyes were completely black, and its mouth, still open, stretched even wider, almost like it was unhinging its jaw. For a moment, everything was silent. And then it spoke. Stay. The voice was a rasp, low and guttural, like the last breath of a dying animal. My blood ran cold. I slammed my hand down on the horn, the blaring noise cutting through the eerie quiet. The figures recoiled for a second, just enough time for me to try the ignition one last time. The car roared to life. Go, 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 Kyle yelled, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as we peeled out of there, the figures disappearing in the rearview mirror as we sped down the empty road. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the town long behind us. No one spoke for a long time. We were too shaken, too terrified to even process what had just happened. Finally, Kyle broke the silence. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We never spoke about it again. Not really. I think we were too afraid that talking about it would somehow make it real, like acknowledging it would invite those things back into our lives. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I think about that town, about the figures, about the way they moved, the way they spoke, and I wonder if we really escaped. Because sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I can still hear that voice. Stay. And every time I wonder if, one day, I will. Just when you think it couldn't get worse, the next story proves you wrong. I never really believed in ghost stories or urban legends. Not until that weekend. It was supposed to be just a fun, relaxing camping trip. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just a group of friends, a few days off, and a quiet spot by the lake. It all started so normally, so predictably, that I never could have guessed how wrong everything would go. My buddies and I had been planning this trip for weeks. We'd all been feeling burnt out from work, life, and whatever else was gnawing at us. So when Jason suggested we head up to this lake he knew, a few hours out of the city, it seemed perfect. No cell service, no work emails, just fresh air and the sound of water lapping against the shore. We packed our tents, some food, a couple of beers, and headed out early Friday morning. The drive was long but pleasant enough. Jason kept talking about how peaceful the lake was, how it was the perfect place to disconnect. The rest of us, Matt, Sarah, and I, were mostly focused on just getting there. I didn't pay much attention to Jason's rambling about the lake, and now, thinking back, I wish I had. Maybe I would have seen the warning signs. Maybe I would have known what we were walking into. We arrived around midday, and the place was gorgeous. Picture perfect, really. The lake was still, almost too still, reflecting the sky like a giant mirror. It was surrounded by thick woods, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves or a bird calling in the distance. We set up camp near the water, with a clear view of the lake. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. The first day passed without incident. We spent the afternoon swimming, lounging around the campsite, and just relaxing. By the time night fell, we were sitting around a campfire, roasting marshmallows, and talking about nothing in particular. It was the kind of night that makes you forget everything. That's when it started. I don't remember exactly when I first noticed it. Maybe it was just after Sarah finished telling some dumb story about a haunted house she used to live near. Or maybe it was right before Jason got up to grab another beer from the cooler. But there was this sound. A faint rustling, like something moving through the woods behind us. At first, none of us really reacted. It was probably just a raccoon or some other animal. We were in the middle of the forest, after all. But the noise kept coming. Closer, slower, a steady shuffling sound, like footsteps, but too soft to be human. Jason laughed it off. "Must be a deer," he said, cracking open his beer. We all chuckled, trying to shake off the growing unease. But the sound didn't stop. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, my eyes straining to see past the flickering firelight into the pitch-black woods beyond. Then came the splash. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make us all turn our heads. The lake. Something had fallen into the water, or maybe something had come out of it. I don't know. We all grabbed our flashlights and pointed them towards the lake, but there was nothing. The surface was as smooth and glassy as it had been all day. "I'm sure it was just a fish," Matt said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as his words. We tried to laugh again, but the tension was thick now, impossible to ignore. Still, we convinced ourselves there was nothing to worry about and went back to our conversation, trying to lighten the mood. But a few minutes later, Sarah froze, her eyes wide and staring across the lake. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all turned, following her gaze. At first, I didn't see anything, just the lake, calm and still under the moonlight. But then I noticed it, a figure, standing in the middle of the water, completely still. It was too far to make out any details, but it was clearly a person, or at least something shaped like one. No one said anything. We just sat there, staring, our flashlights pointed uselessly at the lake, unable to move. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds, minutes, it felt like forever. And then Jason stood up. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping towards the edge of the water. "Who's out there?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. Jason took another step forward, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." He hesitated, then nodded, backing away from the water. None of us could tear our eyes away from the figure. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. The lake was empty again. We all stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Jason was the first to speak. "It's late," he said quietly. "Let's just go to bed." We agreed, though none of us felt particularly tired. We retreated to our tents, each of us too spooked to talk about what we'd seen. I lay there for hours, wide awake, listening to the sounds of the night. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind made my heart race. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer this time, moving slowly around the campsite. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath shallow and rapid. I wanted to get up, to look outside, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The footsteps circled our tents, never stopping, never hurrying, just pacing. Back and forth, and then silence. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But eventually I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal again. Except it wasn't. Matt was gone. At first, we thought he had just gone for a walk or a swim, but after an hour of searching, we found no sign of him. His tent was empty, his belongings untouched. It was like he had vanished in the middle of the night. We tried to stay calm, telling ourselves he'd just wandered off and would be back soon. But as the day wore on, the unease grew. We combed the area, shouting his name, but the forest was eerily quiet. By the time the sun started to set, panic had set in. We decided to leave, to go get help. But when we tried to find the path we'd come in on, it was gone. The trees seemed to have shifted, closing in around us, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. No matter which direction we went, we always ended up back at the lake. And then, as night fell, we saw it again. The figure. Standing in the middle of the lake, watching us. Jason was the next to go. One moment he was beside me and the next, gone. No scream, no struggle, just silence. Sarah and I ran, but there was nowhere to go. The forest closed in around us, the lake looming ever closer. I don't know how long we ran before we collapsed, exhausted and terrified. Now it's just me. Sarah's gone too, swallowed by the darkness. And the figure, it's closer now. I can feel it watching me, waiting. I don't know what it wants, but I can't run anymore. There's nowhere left to go. I'm sitting by the fire, writing this down, hoping someone will find it. Maybe someone will understand. Maybe someone will figure out what happened to us. But I don't think I'll be around to see it. The footsteps are back, and they're right outside my tent. That was just a taste of the terror. Now let's dive into something even more disturbing. It started like any other day. I was heading back home from a long trip to visit an old friend who lived in a small town a few hours away. The weekend had been fun, but as always, it was tiring, and I was eager to get home, relax, and crash on my couch. The sun was setting, and I still had a couple of hours of driving left. The main highway was clogged with traffic, and my phone's GPS suggested an alternate route, a back road that would supposedly cut an hour off my drive. I glanced at the map and saw a thin, winding line snaking through fields and forests. It seemed out of the way, but I figured I'd trust technology. After all, what's the worst that could happen? At first, the road seemed fine, just narrow and a bit winding, like so many rural roads. The scenery quickly changed, though. Wide, open fields turned into dense forests, and the pavement got rougher. There were no streetlights, no houses, not even any other cars. It felt like I was the only person on Earth driving that road. A few hours passed, and I began to feel uneasy. The road had no signs, and it felt like I'd been driving in circles, though the GPS insisted I was still on track. The same trees seemed to pass by again and again, twisted, gnarled, and leaning in as if they were watching me. The worst part was the silence. No birds, no wind, no sound from the outside world at all. Just the soft hum of my car's engine and the crackling of the gravel beneath my tires. I glanced at my gas gauge. Half a tank. I should have had enough to get back, but I was starting to doubt the GPS. Should I turn back? But where to? The road behind me was as empty and desolate as the road ahead. So I pressed on, telling myself I'd find a gas station or a small town soon enough. It was about then that I saw it. Up ahead on the right side of the road stood a figure. From a distance I assumed it was just a person, maybe a hitchhiker or someone waiting for a ride. But as I got closer, my skin crawled. Something was off. The figure was unnaturally tall, too tall for a human. Its body was lanky, almost skeletal, and its face, well, it didn't seem to have a face. Shadows clung to its features, even though the sun was still casting a soft glow over everything. I drove faster, my hands tightening around the steering wheel, telling myself not to look back. My heart pounded, and for a moment I thought I might pull over and turn around, but something in me, maybe pride, maybe fear, kept me going. A mile or so later, I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to still be standing there. But it wasn't. It was ahead of me. Again. There it was, standing in the exact same spot, as if I had never passed it. My pulse raced, and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd gotten turned around and ended up on a different road. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. I floored the gas pedal. The road stretched endlessly ahead. The GPS had lost signal, the screen a blank, mocking grid. I drove faster, gripping the wheel with sweaty palms. No matter how far I went, the landscape never changed. Same trees, same gravel, same figure. I saw it again and again, always in the same place, always watching. My headlights flickered as dusk settled in, and the shadows around me seemed to grow thicker. The trees on either side of the road felt like they were closing in, pushing me deeper into this impossible stretch of road. I checked my gas tank, almost empty. Panic set in. If I didn't find a town soon, I'd be stranded here. The thought of being stuck in this place, in the dark, with that thing standing out there, it made my chest tighten. I tried calling for help, but of course, there was no signal. I was completely alone. That's when I noticed the knocking. It was soft at first, like someone tapping lightly on the roof of the car. I brushed it off as a branch or some gravel bouncing up from the road, but it got louder. A steady, rhythmic knock, like knuckles tapping against the glass. I glanced around but saw nothing. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, even though I knew I couldn't outrun it. Whatever it was, the knocking turned into scraping, like nails dragging along the side of the car. My breath came in shallow gasps and my mind raced with possibilities. Was it following me? Was it on top of the car? My headlights illuminated the figure again, just ahead. This time, I slowed down. I didn't want to, but something compelled me to look at it. Really look at it. As I approached, the knocking stopped, and silence fell over the road once more. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tall and menacing, the shadows still obscuring its face. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I had to know. I had to see. I pulled the car over, barely able to breathe as I cracked the door open. The air outside was thick, heavy, and cold. Colder than it should have been for a summer night. I stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my feet, and slowly walked toward the figure. Every step felt like a lifetime. I was just a few feet away when it shifted. It didn't move like a person. Its body seemed to stretch and ripple, and the shadows around its face grew darker, like they were swallowing the light. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back in the car, to drive until the tank was bone dry, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness that seemed to pour from its body. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like a feeling, a deep vibrating hum that echoed in my bones. It didn't say words. It didn't need to. I understood perfectly. You shouldn't have come here. That's all it said. Or maybe that's all I could comprehend before my legs finally kicked into gear, and I sprinted back to the car. I slammed the door shut, fumbled with the keys, and took off, the tires screeching as I sped down the road. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that thing. But the road didn't end. I drove for what felt like hours, my gas gauge creeping toward empty, and still the same trees, the same shadows, the same endless stretch of road. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure. Always there. Always waiting. I'm writing this now because I don't know how much longer I have. My tank is nearly empty, and the night is closing in. I can feel it watching me. The knocking has started again. I know I can't outrun it. I know it's only a matter of time before it catches up. But what I don't know is what will happen when it does. I can't stop driving. I don't know if I ever will. Think you've heard it all? The next story will make you think again. It started as an ordinary weekend hike. I had taken to hiking recently to escape the noise of the city. There was something calming about being in nature, away from the endless hum of traffic and the never-ending rush of people. My plan was simple: head out to the mountains, follow one of the popular trails, and return before dark. Nothing complicated, nothing too adventurous, just a peaceful walk through the woods. The weather was perfect for it. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I packed lightly: a water bottle, some snacks, a jacket, and my phone, just in case. The trail was easy at first, well-marked and well-trodden. There were other hikers around, but I quickly found myself alone as I moved further in. The deeper I went, the more I enjoyed the solitude. It was just me, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. After a few hours of walking, I came to a fork in the trail. The sign pointing left had been weathered to the point of illegibility, and the path to the right seemed more popular with clear signs of recent use. But for some reason, maybe a sense of adventure or simple curiosity, I chose the left path. In hindsight, it was probably the worst decision of my life. As I ventured down the less traveled path, the trees grew denser. The sun, once bright and welcoming, struggled to filter through the thick canopy overhead. The further I walked, the more I noticed the air around me changing. It was subtle at first, but gradually the temperature began to drop, and the light breeze turned into a cold stillness that clung to the forest like a thick, invisible fog.
About an hour into this detour, I realized I hadn't seen another person for some time. The trail, which had been clear at the start, was now barely discernible. The path wound deeper into the woods, and every step I took felt more isolated than the last. I checked my phone. No signal. Still, I wasn't panicking. I had my bearings, or so I thought. Then, out of nowhere, I stumbled upon it, a small, weathered cabin in a clearing, tucked away from the trail. It looked like something out of a different time, like it had been there for decades, forgotten by the world. The roof sagged slightly. The wooden walls were covered in moss, and the windows were dark, smudged, and fogged over. It looked abandoned, yet somehow not entirely so. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. It was probably just an old hunting lodge, I told myself. Maybe a ranger's cabin. Either way, I didn't plan on staying long. I just needed to get my bearings and figure out how to get back to the main trail. The sun was already beginning to set, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck in the forest after dark. Approaching the cabin, I felt a strange pull. Despite every instinct in my body telling me to keep walking, I stepped closer. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed gently in the breeze. I knocked, half expecting no one to answer. No response. I pushed the door open a little more, peeking inside. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as though no one had been there in years. But the strangest part? There was a fire in the hearth. It wasn't blazing, but it was still smoldering, embers glowing faintly, sending tendrils of smoke curling up the chimney. Someone had been here recently. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside. My voice echoed in the small space, but there was no reply. The silence was unnerving. The air inside was thick and musty, the smell of damp wood and ash overpowering. I took a few more steps, my boots crunching on the wooden floor. Something wasn't right. The place felt wrong, like it was holding on to some dark secret. I turned back to the door, ready to leave, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but it was stuck, like it had been locked from the outside. Panic began to creep in. I yanked at the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't move. My heart started to race. The windows, too, were fogged over, obscuring any view of the outside. I went to one of them and wiped at the glass, hoping to see something, anything, but the fog on the window wasn't on the surface. It was inside the glass, as if the cabin itself was breathing.
Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, scanning the room, but there was nothing. At least, nothing I could see. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. It was coming from the shadows in the far corner of the cabin, a dark mass that seemed to shift and move, even though there was nothing there. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A person? Something else? I had no idea, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I ran back to the door, pulling at it with everything I had, but it still wouldn't open. My heart was pounding in my ears, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs, emerged from the shadows. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were nothing but hollow, dark voids. It moved slowly, deliberately, each step accompanied by that same deep growl, like a predator stalking its prey. I froze, my mind going blank with terror. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as it came closer and closer. Its empty eyes locked onto mine. The room grew colder, the air thick with dread, and the thing, whatever it was, reached out toward me. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth roared to life, flames leaping up the chimney with a violent crackle. The creature stopped, its hand hovering inches from my face, as if the fire had startled it. Without thinking, I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy iron poker, and swung it wildly at the figure. It didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a bone-chilling screech, a sound so unnatural and piercing that it felt like my ears would burst. I dropped the poker and stumbled back, desperately trying to shield myself from the noise. The creature backed away into the shadows, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking, waiting. I tried the door again, and this time, miraculously, it opened. I didn't waste a second. I bolted out of the cabin, running as fast as I could through the darkening forest. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I found my way back to the main trail, the sun had set, and the forest was bathed in darkness. I stumbled down the path, half crazed with fear, until I finally reached my car. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and peeling out of there without a second thought. I've never been back to those mountains since. I don't even like to talk about it much. Sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still see it. That thing, those hollow eyes, that cold, empty stare. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something was in that cabin with me, and it wasn't human. And it's still out there, somewhere. If the last story sent shivers down your spine, you won't believe what's about to happen next. I've always been an outdoor kind of person. Growing up in a small town where the nearest mall was a 45-minute drive away, nature became my playground. Hiking, biking, camping, I did it all. There's something comforting about being surrounded by trees, the crunch of leaves under your boots, and the fresh air filling your lungs. It clears your mind, you know? It's peaceful. But I guess maybe some things are better left alone. It started like any other day. I'd gotten off work early, and the weather was perfect. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long, golden shadows on the trail. The hills outside my town had become a second home to me. I knew almost every nook and cranny of that place. At least I thought I did. I had a few hours to kill before it got dark, so I figured a quick hike wouldn't hurt. Nothing intense, just a walk to clear my head. About an hour in, I was on a path I'd walked hundreds of times before. My feet knew the trail better than I did. I didn't even need to think about where I was going. The trees were thinning out, and up ahead, I could see the spot where I usually stopped for a break. There's this large, flat rock overlooking a small stream, a perfect spot to sit and watch the water. That's when I saw it. The tunnel. It was hidden behind a thick cluster of overgrown bushes, almost like it didn't want to be found. If the sunlight hadn't hit it just right, I might have walked right past it. But there it was, a dark, gaping hole, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I'm not sure how I'd never noticed it before. I'd been through this area dozens of times, and yet here was this tunnel, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. I should have just walked away. I know that now, but at the time, well, I was curious. I mean, who wouldn't be? It was like finding a secret, something no one else knew about. I figured maybe it was an old mining tunnel or some kind of forgotten passage. Nothing too crazy, right? I pushed aside the bushes and stepped closer, peering into the darkness. The entrance sloped down slightly, and the ground was damp, slick with mud. The air coming from inside was cool, much colder than it should have been for that time of year. That should have been my second warning, but I ignored it. I pulled out my flashlight from my backpack. I always carried one, just in case, and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough stone walls inside. I could see a few feet ahead of me, but beyond that, the tunnel just stretched deeper into the earth. I hesitated for a moment. It felt wrong. The kind of wrong that gnaws at the back of your mind, telling you to turn around. But I didn't. Something about it was pulling me in. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just too stubborn to turn back. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. My breath came out in small clouds, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. The walls were damp, slick with moisture, and the ground was uneven. It smelled musty, like wet stone and earth that hadn't seen the light of day in years. I kept my flashlight steady, scanning the walls as I walked. That's when I noticed the markings. At first, they looked like random scratches, jagged lines carved into the stone. But as I moved deeper, I realized they weren't random. They formed shapes, symbols, almost like some kind of ancient writing. I couldn't make sense of them. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. That was my third warning. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, narrowing in some places and widening in others. It was like a maze, and soon I couldn't tell how far I'd gone. The entrance was long out of sight, and my phone had no signal. I wasn't scared yet, just uneasy. I figured I'd explore for a few more minutes, then head back. But then the flashlight flickered. I stopped dead in my tracks, tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered again, the light dimming for a split second before stabilizing. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time my flashlight had acted up, but in the cold, suffocating darkness of that tunnel, it felt different, like something was messing with it. I took a deep breath and kept going. The tunnel was silent, except for the soft sound of my boots squishing in the damp mud. But then, just at the edge of the light, I saw something move. It was quick. So quick that for a moment I thought I imagined it. A shadow darting across the tunnel ahead of me. My heart raced and I froze, shining the light in the direction of the movement. Nothing. Just the rough, stone walls, damp and cold. I should have turned back. God, I should have just turned around and walked out of there. But I didn't. Instead, I kept moving forward, slower this time, my eyes scanning every inch of the tunnel. The flashlight flickered again, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. There was something down there with me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. You know that feeling when someone's watching you? It was like that. But worse. Much worse. I took another step, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like something breathing. It was faint, but it echoed off the tunnel walls, growing louder with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like they were stuck in quicksand. I didn't want to move, but I had to. I had to get out of there. I turned around, ready to sprint back the way I came, but the tunnel, it looked different. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. I couldn't see the entrance anymore, just an endless stretch of darkness behind me. It didn't make sense. I hadn't gone that far. I should have been able to see the way out, but it was like the tunnel had changed, shifted. Panic set in. I started running, the sound of my boots slapping against the wet ground echoing in my ears. The flashlight flickered wildly now, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure. It was crawling on all fours, its body twisted and unnatural, its skin pale and slick like it had been living in the dark for centuries. But what terrified me the most were its eyes, glowing in the darkness, staring right at me. I ran faster. The sound of its crawling grew louder, closer. I could hear its claws scraping against the stone, its breath ragged and wet. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, praying that I'd find the way out. But the tunnel never seemed to end. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, the walls just kept closing in, twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, the sound of that thing chasing me grew louder, and I couldn't breathe. I don't remember how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. But eventually my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the cold, wet ground, gasping for breath. The flashlight slipped from my hand, the beam flickering one last time before going dark. I lay there, in the pitch-black silence, waiting for the thing to catch me, to drag me into whatever hell it had come from. But it didn't. The tunnel was silent again, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. Slowly I pushed myself up, my hands shaking, my body trembling. I reached for the flashlight, praying it would still work. And by some miracle it did. The beam of light cut through the darkness once more, but the tunnel was empty. No figure, no glowing eyes, just the damp stone walls, stretching endlessly in both directions. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I stumbled to my feet and started walking. No, running, back the way I came. I didn't care if the tunnel had shifted. I didn't care if it didn't make sense. I just had to get out. And eventually, I did. The tunnel spit me out into the woods, the setting sun casting long shadows over the trees. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know if I even went the right way. But somehow, I was back on the trail, back in the world that made sense. But the thing is, I can still feel it. Even now, weeks later, I can feel those eyes on me, watching, waiting. The tunnel is still out there, hidden in the hills, a dark, gaping maw, and I know it's not done with me. Not yet. That was only the beginning. What's next will make your heart race even faster. I remember that day so clearly. It was supposed to be a fun night, an adventure, a way to shake off the boredom of a regular weekend. We were just a group of friends, looking for something different, something thrilling. We'd done all the usual stuff, movies, hiking, even the local escape room, but none of it seemed to scratch that itch for excitement. Then Sarah mentioned the old amusement park. We'd heard rumors about it, of course. Everyone in town had. The place had been shut down for over a decade after a fire wiped out most of the main attractions. Nobody had died, but there had been whispers about people seeing strange things there ever since. Some kids even swore they heard laughter or music coming from the place late at night, though no one ever actually saw anything. It was the kind of local legend everyone heard, but no one really believed. Naturally, that made it the perfect place for us to explore. A little urban adventure, a bit of harmless fun. The park was a good 30-minute drive from the town, and by the time we got there, the sun had already dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. From the outside, the place looked exactly like you'd expect. Rusted gates, faded signs, and overgrown weeds pushing through the cracks in the concrete. The entrance was blocked off with a giant padlock, but that didn't stop us. Sarah had brought bolt cutters. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" asked Ben, the cautious one of the group. He was always the voice of reason, the one who hesitated whenever things got a little too real. "Come on, Ben. Don't be such a wuss," Sarah teased, already working on the lock. She had that gleam in her eye, the one that said there was no backing down now. I glanced at Jake, my best friend since middle school, who just shrugged with a grin. "It'll be fun," he said. "Just a quick look around, and then we're out." The lock snapped open with a loud clang, and Sarah pushed the gates open. The sound echoed through the still air, unnervingly loud. It was almost too quiet around us, like the place had swallowed all the usual sounds of the night. No wind, no crickets, just silence. "Let's go," Sarah said, leading the way inside. The first thing that struck me was how intact everything still was. I mean, yeah, the rides were rusty, and the paint was peeling off the signs, but it was all still there. The roller coasters loomed in the distance, their metal tracks silhouetted against the darkening sky. The Ferris wheel stood frozen in place, its seats dangling like ghostly reminders of a time long gone. Even the carnival games were still set up, the prizes long since decayed but the booths eerily intact. "Creepy," Jake muttered, snapping a picture with his phone. "But kind of cool, right?" We wandered deeper into the park, past the ticket booth and the food stands. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that the park was waiting, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. "Do you hear that?" Sarah suddenly asked, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" I asked, though I could already sense what she meant. There was something faint, just on the edge of hearing, like a distant melody. "Is that music?" Ben asked, his voice shaking slightly. We all stood still. Sure enough, there it was, a faint, scratchy tune, like something you'd hear from an old, broken music box. It was coming from deeper inside the park. "That's just the wind," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "There is no wind," Sarah pointed out, her voice barely above a whisper. Despite every instinct telling me to turn back, we pressed on. The music grew louder as we approached one of the older rides, a carousel, its once bright colors now faded and chipped. The horses stood frozen, their glassy eyes staring out into the night as though they were waiting for riders who would never come. Then the carousel moved. At first it was just a slight creak, the kind you'd expect from something that old, but then it started to spin. Slowly at first, but then faster, as if some invisible hand had flicked the switch. "Okay, this is seriously messed up," Ben muttered, backing away. "We need to go." I wanted to agree, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the carousel. The lights flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the ground, and the music was louder now, clearer. It wasn't a recording, it was live, like there was an orchestra hidden somewhere, playing just for us. Then, out of nowhere, the gate slammed shut. "Did you do that?" Jake asked Sarah, his voice sharp with panic. "No, I didn't touch it." We ran back to the entrance, but the gate was locked. The padlock was back, fully intact, like we'd never cut it off. "What the hell?" Ben muttered, yanking at the gate. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't fun anymore. This wasn't an adventure. This was something else, something wrong. Suddenly, we heard it. A laugh, soft at first, but unmistakable. It echoed through the empty park, bouncing off the silent rides and deserted booths. It wasn't a happy sound. It was mocking, like whoever, or whatever, was watching us was enjoying our fear. "There's someone here," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Let's find another way out," Jake said, grabbing my arm. "Come on." We took off, running through the park, the laughter following us. Every ride we passed seemed to come to life. The roller coasters creaked, the Ferris wheel groaned, the funhouse lights flickered on and off. It was as if the park itself was waking up. Finally, we found a service gate near the back, slightly ajar. We didn't hesitate. We pushed through it and ran, not stopping until we reached the car. None of us said a word on the drive back. We didn't need to. We all knew something had happened back there, something we couldn't explain. We never spoke about that night again, but I still think about it sometimes. About how the park came alive, about the laughter, about the feeling that we were being watched. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that carousel music, faint and scratchy, like it's calling me back. But I'll never go. Not ever. Hold on tight, because the next story will take fear to a whole new level. It started like any other road trip. It was me, my girlfriend Emily, and our two closest friends, Josh and Lisa. We were doing one of those spur-of-the-moment trips, nothing big or extravagant. We just wanted to get away from the city for a weekend. Josh had found a place to rent on the outskirts of some mountain range we'd never been to before. It looked quaint in the photos, and it wasn't too far away from home. A perfect, quiet getaway. The drive was nice at first, the kind of winding road through the countryside that makes you feel small against the vastness of nature. Rolling hills, thick forests, and the occasional small town popping up in between stretches of wilderness. It was exactly what we needed. We were joking around, playing music, taking in the views, just the usual road trip vibes. But then, somewhere along the way, we took a wrong turn. None of us noticed at first. The roads up in the mountains all looked the same after a while. Twisty, narrow, with nothing but trees on either side. The GPS signal started cutting out, and before long, we realized we hadn't seen another car or even a sign in what felt like hours. We weren't worried at first, just kind of annoyed. Josh kept saying, "We'll hit the main road soon enough." He wasn't worried, so the rest of us weren't either. But we didn't. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road, and that's when we saw it, the town. I use the word town loosely. It was more like a cluster of old buildings huddled together, tucked into a valley we hadn't noticed until we were practically on top of it. We slowed down as we drove through. Everything about it felt wrong. The place was completely deserted. The buildings looked ancient, weathered wood, crumbling brick, windows shattered or boarded up. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. But there was something off about it, like it wasn't as empty as it seemed. "Do you think anyone lives here?" Lisa asked, peering out the window. "Doubt it," Josh said. "This place looks like it's been dead for years." But as we drove deeper into the town, I started feeling like we were being watched. I kept glancing out the window, expecting to see someone, or something, peeking out from one of the darkened windows. But there was nothing. Just empty streets and decaying buildings. "I don't like this," Emily muttered from the passenger seat. "We should just turn around and get out of here." "I'm with her," Lisa added, her voice a little shaky, but there was no easy way out. The streets wound through the town like a maze, and every turn we made seemed to take us deeper into the place. Then we heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind, a soft, low humming barely audible over the sound of the car's engine. But the more we drove, the louder it got. It was coming from somewhere deep in the town, a tune like an old folk song carried on the wind. "You guys hear that?" Josh asked, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. We all nodded. Too uneasy to speak. The humming was growing louder, more distinct. There were voices in it now, singing, no chanting, some kind of melody that none of us recognized. But something about the way they sang, it wasn't right. "We need to get out of here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." Josh hit the gas, but the car sputtered and jerked to a halt. Dead. Just like that. The engine refused to turn over, and we were stranded in the middle of this ghost town with the sun sinking fast behind the mountains. "Damn it," Josh cursed, slamming his hand on the steering wheel. "Maybe it's the battery?" Lisa suggested weakly, though we all knew something was wrong. Something beyond a simple car problem. The humming grew louder, surrounding us. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I glanced out the window and froze. There were people standing in the street. At least, I think they were people. They were far away, just silhouettes in the fading light, but there was something unnatural about the way they stood. Perfectly still, faces turned toward us, unmoving. "They weren't there before," Emily whispered, gripping my arm. "No," I said, my voice barely a breath. "They weren't." Josh tried the ignition again, but the engine was dead. We were stuck. Maybe we should go talk to them, Lisa said, though her voice was full of doubt. Maybe they can help. No way, I said, shaking my head. Something's wrong with this place. We need to get out of here. But there was nowhere to go. The streets of the town seemed to shift around us, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Every time we tried to walk out of the town, we ended up right back where we started. And the humming. God, the humming. It was everywhere, and it was getting louder. We found ourselves in the center of town, standing in front of what must have once been the town hall or something. The building was massive, its windows dark and empty, its doors hanging crooked on their hinges, and that's when we saw them. A group of people, maybe a dozen or so, stood in a circle in the middle of the square. They were all facing inward, their backs to us, swaying gently as they sang that eerie, twisted tune. Their faces were blank, their eyes glazed over like they weren't really there. But they were singing. Only the words were all wrong. Twisted, garbled, like they were speaking a language that shouldn't exist. Emily grabbed my hand and I could feel her trembling. "We need to go?" she whispered. "We need to go now." But as we turned to leave, the town shifted again. The streets no longer led out. No matter which way we went, we ended up back in that same square with the singers swaying and humming their dreadful tune. Then, without warning, the humming stopped. The silence was worse than the song. It pressed in on us, heavy and suffocating. And in that silence, they turned. One by one, the people in the circle turned to face us. Their mouths hung open, wide and unnatural, like they were screaming, but no sound came out. Just that horrible, empty silence. I don't remember much after that. I remember running faster than I've ever run in my life. But the town wouldn't let us go. Every street twisted back in on itself. The buildings seemed to close in around us, the walls leaning, the windows staring. Eventually, we made it back to the car. I don't know how, but somehow we did. Josh tried the engine one last time, and miraculously it roared to life. We didn't look back as we sped out of the town, but I could still hear it in the back of my mind, the humming. It followed us, growing softer and softer until it finally faded away. We never spoke about it after that. We just drove until we found a motel and stayed there for the night. None of us slept, and we never found that town on a map. We tried looking it up after we got home, but there was nothing. No record of it. No name. Just a wrong turn we took into the mountains, and a place that shouldn't have existed. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I think I hear it again. The humming. You might want to leave the lights on for this next one. It's about to get even darker. I know it sounds cliché, but we really shouldn't have gone in. The old house had been abandoned for years, a crumbling relic at the edge of town that had become more of a local legend than anything else. Kids told stories about it around campfires, daring each other to spend a night there, to knock on the front door, or even just to walk past it after sunset. No one ever did, though. Not seriously, at least. There was something about that place, something that made people uneasy. But that's what made it so tempting for me and my friends. We weren't scared of an old house. We were curious, stupidly curious. It was a Saturday afternoon when we finally decided to check it out. It was me, Jamie, and Tom. We'd been hanging out, doing the usual teenage stuff, biking around, playing video games, talking about school. Then someone brought up the house. I don't remember who. But the second it was mentioned, we all kind of gave each other that look. You know the one. The look that says, "Are we really going to do this?" But no one backed down. The walk to the house was longer than I remembered. Maybe because I hadn't been near it since I was a kid. Back then, even riding past it on my bike gave me the creeps. The house sat on the outskirts of town, nestled in a grove of trees that always seemed a little too dense, a little too dark. The house itself was this huge, sagging Victorian, its roof caved in places, the windows shattered or boarded up. The yard was overgrown, the grass waist-high and tangled with weeds. From a distance, it didn't even look like a house anymore. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a skeleton of a place, barely clinging to life. As we got closer, I started to feel that familiar unease creeping up my spine, but I ignored it. Jamie and Tom seemed fine, chatting away, probably trying to shake off their own nerves. I didn't want to be the one to chicken out, so I kept my mouth shut. When we finally reached the front gate, it took all of us a second to work up the nerve to push it open. The gate groaned like it hadn't been moved in years, but it gave way easily enough. We stepped onto the cracked stone pathway, the house looming above us, its dark windows like eyes staring down. The air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of decay and something else I couldn't quite place. Something musty and rotten. "All right, we made it," Jamie said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "Let's just go inside and take a quick look," Tom added. "We don't have to stay long." The front door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for us. Tom was the first to step inside, and Jamie followed close behind. I lingered for a second, staring up at the house, my gut screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't be the one to back out now, so I swallowed my fear and stepped inside. The house was exactly what you'd expect: dark, cold, and suffocating. The smell of rot was stronger here, almost unbearable. Dust hung thick in the air, coating everything in a layer of grime. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and every step echoed like we were disturbing something that had been sleeping for years. The light from the outside barely reached into the house, leaving most of it shrouded in shadows. "Man, this place is creepy," Jamie muttered, glancing around. Tom, ever the bold one, wandered ahead into what looked like a living room. The furniture was still there, but it was all covered in sheets that had turned brown with age. Everything felt frozen in time, like the people who once lived here had just up and left in the middle of the night. "I don't think anyone's been here for a long time," Tom said, running his hand over one of the dusty sheets. I didn't say anything. I was too busy listening. It was so quiet in there, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. We moved further into the house, poking around in the dim light, our footsteps the only sound. The deeper we went, the colder it got. And then we found them. The symbols. They were painted on the walls in what looked like dried blood. Strange, looping shapes that didn't make any sense. I'd never seen anything like them before, and neither had Jamie or Tom. They were all over the walls in the hallway, leading up to the second floor. "What the hell is this?" Jamie whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "I don't know, man," Tom replied. "But it's creepy as hell. We should have turned around right then. But we didn't. Instead, we kept moving, drawn in by the mystery of it all. The air was getting colder, unnaturally cold, and I started to feel like we weren't alone anymore. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. It felt like the house was watching us, listening to us, and then we heard it. At first, it was faint, a whisper, barely audible, but enough to make us freeze in our tracks. We looked at each other wide-eyed, trying to figure out if we had all heard the same thing. Then it came again, a little louder this time, echoing down the hallway. It wasn't words, not exactly, just sounds, like someone or something trying to speak but not quite able to. "Did you hear that?" Jamie asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah," Tom said, his bravado fading. "Let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but when we got back to the front door, it wouldn't budge. Tom yanked on the handle, but it didn't move an inch. It was like the door had been welded shut. Panic started to set in. "Try the windows," I suggested, my heart racing. We rushed to the nearest window, but no matter how hard we pushed, it wouldn't open. None of them would. It was like the house didn't want us to leave. The whispers were getting louder now, closer. We all huddled together in the middle of the room, not sure what to do. And that's when I saw it. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and shadowy, its eyes glowing in the dark. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching us, studying us. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. "What the hell is that?" Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us answered. We couldn't, we were too scared. The figure took a step forward, its glowing eyes fixed on us. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, swirling around us like a storm. And then, everything went dark. I don't remember much after that. Just the feeling of cold and the whispers. Always the whispers. When I woke up, I was lying in the front yard, the sun setting behind the trees. Jamie and Tom were next to me, just as dazed and confused as I was. The house stood silent and still behind us, as if nothing had happened. We never talked about what we saw that day. We couldn't, but I know what I felt, and I know I'll never go back to that house again. We shouldn't have gone in. If you thought the last story was terrifying, this next one will leave you speechless. I've always been the type to seek adventure. A long weekend on the water was the perfect escape from the grind of everyday life. My friends and I rented a small boat, eager to explore the coastline of our little town. We were excited, just four 20-somethings ready to embrace the sun, laughter, and freedom of the open sea. On that particular day, the sun hung high in the sky, casting a shimmering glow over the water. As we navigated the gentle waves, the thrill of possibility enveloped us. We laughed, splashed, and took turns at the helm, feeling invincible as we raced along the shoreline. However, a series of sharp turns and our poor map-reading skills soon led us off course. Instead of the familiar beaches, we found ourselves staring at a distant shore, one we had never seen before. "This can't be right," I said, squinting into the horizon. My friend Mia, who had been helping me navigate, looked at the map, her brow furrowed. "Maybe we should check it out," she suggested, a mix of curiosity and mischief in her voice. The others cheered in agreement, and against my better judgment, we decided to head toward the unfamiliar land. As we approached, the island revealed itself, a picturesque paradise, with white sandy beaches and lush greenery, swaying palm trees lining the shore. It looked like something out of a travel brochure, but a slight unease tickled the back of my mind. The air felt thick, almost stagnant, as if the island were holding its breath. We anchored the boat and waded ashore, our laughter echoing as we splashed in the shallow water. Yet, when I stepped onto the sand, the atmosphere shifted. The warm sun vanished behind a dense cloud, casting a shadow over our joyful spirits. The wind stilled, and the palm trees began to sway, not with the breeze, but as if something unseen was moving among them. "Did you guys feel that?" I asked, glancing at my friends. They shrugged, laughing it off. But I could sense something deeper. As we ventured inland, the shadows around us deepened, creeping closer with every step we took. The lush vegetation soon turned into a thick jungle, the air growing heavy and damp. We found strange carvings on the rocks, patterns that twisted and writhed like the shadows themselves. They felt ancient, filled with a strange energy that made my skin crawl. I could hear whispers in a language I couldn't understand, echoing around us, though I couldn't pinpoint their source. "Are you hearing that?" She nodded, her face pale. "It sounds like voices." We pressed on, the thrill of adventure fading with each unsettling whisper. It was as if the island was alive, breathing, watching us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting eerie shadows, the jungle darkened rapidly. The peaceful chirping of crickets transformed into an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint murmurs that seemed to seep from the very earth beneath our feet. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, my heart pounding in my chest. The once inviting landscape now felt hostile, every rustle in the bushes igniting a sense of dread. But when we turned to retrace our steps, the path seemed unfamiliar. What had once been a clear route back to the beach now appeared twisted and convoluted, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Panic set in as we stumbled through the dense underbrush, the shadows growing thicker around us. The whispers escalated, rising into agonized screams that clawed at our sanity. "What is happening?" screamed Jake, his eyes wide with terror. The group hurriedly gathered, trying to remain calm, but I could see the fear mirrored in their faces. We burst through the trees and reached the beach, only to find the boat missing. I froze, disbelief flooding my senses. Where is it? It was just here. The ocean stretched out before us, dark and foreboding, the waves crashing against the shore like a heartbeat quickening. The whispers morphed into a cacophony of screams, echoing off the rocks and rolling over the sand. The shadows twisted and turned, taking shapes that sent chills down my spine. They felt alive, hungry. "Run!" I shouted, and we dashed along the shore, our feet pounding against the sand. But the shadows followed, growing more aggressive, reaching out with tendrils of darkness. I glanced back, my heart racing. It was as if the very night itself had come to life, chasing us down. Mia tripped, and I felt a surge of panic. "Get up!" I yelled, but the shadows were upon us, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down. She screamed, the sound piercing through the night as she was engulfed by darkness. We pulled her up just in time, adrenaline fueling our escape. "The trees!" I shouted, spotting a cluster of thick trunks further down the beach. We veered toward them, hoping they could offer some kind of shelter. But as we reached the trees, I felt a sharp tug at my shirt, and a shadowy hand grasped my wrist. In that moment, everything slowed. I looked back, and the night was alive with shapes and whispers, all twisting toward us. A figure, blurred and indistinct, emerged from the depths of the shadows, and I could almost make out its features. It grinned, wide and unsettling, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. I stumbled back, yanking my arm free just as we darted between the trees. The whispers intensified, screaming now, echoing our panic. I could see my friends ahead, their faces ghostly pale as they pressed on. But I could still feel the figure's gaze on me, its laughter ringing in my ears. We ran until our lungs burned, but no matter how far we went, the whispers never ceased, and the shadows seemed to close in tighter. We ducked under branches, desperate to escape the clutching darkness. Finally, I spotted a break in the foliage, a narrow path leading toward the beach. "Come on!" I yelled, leading the way as the path opened up before us. But as we burst through the final thicket, I froze. The beach was empty. The boat was gone, the waves crashing harshly against the rocks, and the dark silhouette of the island loomed behind us. The whispers faded into a haunting silence, the shadows retreating for now. We stood there, panting and terrified, not knowing what to do. It felt like a cruel joke, as if the island had swallowed our escape. "What do we do now?" Mia gasped, looking at the empty horizon. And then, just when I thought we had escaped, I felt a presence behind us. The shadows began to shift again, creeping closer, curling around our feet like smoke. The laughter echoed, and I turned to see the indistinct figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us with that same chilling grin. I didn't look back again. We took off down the shore, running toward the vast ocean, where I felt there might still be a way out. But as we sprinted, the shadows grew thicker, swallowing the sound of our footsteps. I don't know how long we ran. The night stretched on, with the shadows clinging to us like a dark memory. We were lost, forever trapped in the grip of something we couldn't understand, as the island loomed behind us, waiting patiently for its next visitors. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, that somewhere beneath its peaceful exterior lies a darkness ready to consume anyone foolish enough to set foot on its shore. What truly happened that night remains a mystery, one I fear will haunt me forever. And as I sit here sharing this story, I can't help but wonder, what if it's not over? What if the whispers have only just begun?